What's going on, everybody? It's Neil from 2AF. Was supposed to put one of these up last week, but didn't. I like to put them up at the end of the month, but here we are at the first. It's time for another gun history / gun story video. Today, we're talking about the Knight's Armament SR25 ECC that's been made into M110 K1. Ever since I found out about Knight's Armament SR25, I wanted one. They've always been expensive. Back then, I mean, I don't know, I think they were probably, for an out-of-the-box gun, they were probably the most expensive 308 style AR you could get. Back then, there weren't a lot of choices, and even fewer good choices. In the early 2000s, like maybe 2005 or 6 or so, I had gotten an Armalite AR-10 20-inch stainless barrel. It was a nice gun. Worked pretty well, was pretty accurate, but you know, it never really, my want in a Knight's Armament SR25 never went away. So fast forward a few years, it was probably about 2011, maybe early 2012 or so. I had gotten a Knight's Armament SR25 ECC. So that was the model that was available at that time. It had stayed primarily in stock configuration. I think very early on, I just used one of my current silencers, the KAC 762 SD N6 for this. And I had probably some mag pull furniture on it that was painted in the gray color that the mags came in. But then we started seeing pictures of the M110 K1 that was basically used this model. And it was all painted tan, and it had some kind of specific furniture on it, like the Magpul ACS stock, the loopholed Mark 8 CQB-SS. I don't know if grips were any specific flavor or not, but in any case, I put one together like that. And when asking a friend of mine who worked at Knight's Armament at the time and who would have been involved with these things, you know, do they use Surefire 762 Mini, or do they use the Knight's Armament, the new Knight's Armament cans? And he said, really, it just depends on who got it. So at that time, I had gotten the Knight's Armament, the Surefire 762 Mini to put on here. I had gotten the whole gun painted tan, gotten the right stock, MEAD grip, loopholed CQB-SS, MK8 with the Horus reticle in a Knight's Armament 34mm mount. And really, that's all of the modifications that have been done to the gun, with the exception of having it painted tan. These were super cool guns, man. Heavy dimpled barrel under here. So even though the barrel profile, let me see if I can get you to see this. The barrel profile on here, it comes out almost to the full diameter of the inside of the rail. But it's got pretty heavily dimpling. It's pretty heavily dimpled as well. So that does save weight. Now, it's not a lightweight gun, but it's not nearly as heavy as some others can be. It's not impossible, especially if you take the can off, it's not impossible to run this like a carbine. The other really cool thing about this was, well, it's back to the barrel. This is a hammer forged, chrome lined, but match grade barrel. These barrels have traditionally been, I would say, more accurate than most of the other chrome lined, hammer forged barrels that you would run across. It's not a dramatic amount, but these have always been pretty accurate guns. Back on the stock, we've got the Magpul ACS with their enhanced pad. The QD socket is installed here. This is factory Knight's Armament. Receiver extension, factory Knight's Armament. Castle nut with their QD end plate here. Interestingly enough, no, these are not staked, but Knight's Armament says that, you know, they machine both of these parts to very precise tolerances and use very specific torque. And, you know, I mean, I've had this gun since 2011, probably, maybe 2010, and it's been shot a lot, especially for an SR25 style gun, and more than a few of my friends have these as well, and we've never seen any problem with these or really any of the other Knights Armament ones. This was the factory charging handle at the time. It's not ambidextrous. It does have a latch over here. It does have, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, it's got the path that goes here and then puts suppressor gas out to this side. Your flip up, 45-degree flip up sights from Knights Armament. These came on the gun right out of the box. Knights Armament ambi safety with the scalloped selector on the right side. Magpul Miad grip set up in the small configuration without a finger notch in the front. Standard Knights Armament trigger guard, standard Knights Armament trigger. This is a Knights Armament SR25 mag with the 308 mag pull. It's put on sideways. A lot of the times this piece here was kind of meant to go from left to right instead of front to back, but some people, including myself, we put them on going from front to back or back to front, so it acts as a bumper for this magazine. So if you drop it, the steel and the floor plate and everything, it's all protected in case you're dropping it onto a hard surface. Factory bolt group, which includes that bolt carrier. It's got, this is a URX rail. Which specific model is, so it's URX 3.1. The part number is 30259. And you know, I didn't even know I really had this until much later on. Somebody mentioned it to me. Shortly after they were making these guns, this rail section that's here, it was cut back, I don't know, like 2 or 3 notches. And then these longer ones, there were not very many of them, but they became known as like the diving board rail, just because this extends out over the gas block here. So apparently not too many of those out there. I was fortunate enough that the time when I got mine, it just happened to be the ones that they were using. Underneath here, I've got a Surefire muzzle brake that is 3/4 by 24. That is the thread pitch of Knights Armament SR25 barrels. So if you have an SR25 and you want to change the muzzle device, just be sure you're not getting the standard 5/8 by 24. It will not fit on the Knights Armament SR25s. I think I mentioned it already. Loophole Mark 8 CQB-SS. I'm going to talk for a minute about this scope because this scope was really something else. Like I said, I got this gun somewhere around 2011, maybe 2012, and if I have been informed correctly, this scope was developed almost in conjunction with this rifle, the SR25 M110 K1. It wasn't, it was probably one of the first 1:8 optics that was on the market. You can get it with a few different reticles, and this one had the Horus reticle, which it kind of has over time become the most desirable one. The interesting thing about this was when this was out, really all we had was 1-4s. Maybe there were some 1-6s, right? Very few scopes. This has a first focal plane, so not a lot of them had that, especially not with a Horus reticle. And this Horus reticle, around the crosshair, there's a circle. And that circle is what illuminates. Now the illumination on this was bright. It was sufficiently bright to use in broad daylight. Now the interesting thing is because the reticle was first focal plane and there was a circle around the crosshair, when you dialed it down to like 1 power, because it was first focal plane, everything reduced in size and that circle became a dot. And that was your illuminated red dot in the center. So that was pretty unique and I thought a pretty cool idea. Now, one of the drawbacks to this was like, you ever hear about like your eye box? So the illumination, the eye box on the illumination was really tight. So if the scope was moving around much in front of your eye, it would appear like the lit reticle was flickering. It wasn't flickering. It was just that you couldn't see the illumination if you were moving your head around a lot. So that was one of the things that wasn't ideal about this scope. But, you know, I got to go back and say, like, again, we're back in 2011, maybe 2012 or so. This scope back then, when they first came out, it was like $4 grand. That was expensive. There was not a lot of scopes out there that you paid that much money for. But because there was really nothing else like this on the market, people were paying it. Over time, the price of the scope went down till it was under $3 grand. But the Horus model was always kind of more expensive. I think it was always somewhere around $2,800. Eventually, they discontinued them, and you really can't get them anymore. And now, especially the Horus models, they go for a bunch of money. But really, the thing I wanted to mention about this scope was it's over 10 years old. It's probably somewhere around 14 years old. And it's only really been in the last couple of years that the industry has caught up. And really, not caught up, they've surpassed. I would say, and most people would tell you, that the new Night Force ATACR 1-8 and possibly the Vortex Razor 3 1-10 and some other ones, maybe by Collis and stuff, and they've surpassed this. But the interesting thing to note is all of those scopes have really just come out in the last few years. So this scope was like a decade ahead of its time. And none of the manufacturers that we just talked to, all of which I like, all of which I would be happy to run, none of them had any competition for this scope. Any of the other models that were out there were either 1-4 or 1-6, or they were second focal plane, or maybe if they were first focal plane, the brightly lit dot in the center wasn't very bright, wasn't very usable in the daylight. Or it had a pretty plain or less usable reticle for a larger variety of shooting conditions, or distances for that matter. So the Leupold CQB-SS 1-8 Mark 8 was pretty far ahead of its time. And it's still a viable scope today. So anybody who has one of these, you can run these easily. There might be some advantages to some of those other models that I mentioned to you, but it's not like they're leaps and bounds ahead of this. This is still a good, viable, very usable scope even to this day. I've run across some people who actually prefer it and find that it's still, after all these years, their favorite scope. I wish Leupold would either make it again or come out with a new low power variable. They don't really have any one-to-any things that are in this caliber. So anyway, Knight's Armament M110 K1 built off of an SR25 ECC, set up fairly proper, and man, I've shot this gun out to 1,000 yards. I've used it at carbine matches. One thing I'll say is I remember going every time. As soon as I say that, I remember going to a scoped rifle class, and I don't know, I was shooting with somebody, and he was like, "Man, what silencer do you have? What suppressor is that?" And I said, "Oh, it's a Surefire SOCOM 2 7.62 Mini." And he said, "Yeah, it's pretty loud." And I'm like, "Well, you know, my gun is shooting quieter than your gun right now," because he did not have a silencer or a suppressor on his gun. And he's like, "Well, I've got such and such a suppressor, and you know, it's pretty quiet. It meters at so and so." And I'm like, "Well, where is it?" And he's like, "Oh, I can't put it on my gun. It's too long and it's too heavy for what we're doing." That really said it all to me. And I was like, you know what? My gun's shooting quieter than yours is right now. And this can, and this is really going to hold true for any of the mini cans. You got to go into it just expecting to know that it's not going to be the quietest can on the market. It may not even be close to the quietest can, but it's a lot quieter than shooting with no can. And the can is small enough and light enough where you can leave it on here and still shoot it like a carbine. Now this is bigger and heavier than your standard 5.56 carbines, that's for sure. But as far as 308 guns go, man, this is still pretty small, and I don't want to say it's light, but it's not exceptionally heavy. You keep the can on here and you're shooting way quieter than anybody shooting 308 without a can. So I think that these KACs are pretty useful, just as long as you go into it knowing what to expect. So anyway, gun history, gun story, Knight's Armament SR25 ECC built into an M110 K1. And there you got it. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to go to 2af.com, get signed up for email notifications. You'll have a pretty good sense of stuff that's coming into the warehouse, stuff that's shipping out of the warehouse, and what's going on around 2af.com. All right, man, thanks for joining us again, and share the video, comment if you got any questions, if I had some mistake or something like that, or if you have additional information, leave it down below in the comments. All right, thanks again.